Hi, I'm Arnie Skelton, and each week in this podcast series I'm going to offer you my top 10 tips on particular topics or themes that might be of interest to you as a teacher or manager or both. Hi, and welcome to this week's podcast, which returns to my top 10 tips, not top 15, and this week's topic is all about top 10 traps for busy people. These are from my experience and what other people have told me, the things that are most likely to trip people up because they're so busy. So these are my top 10 tips about the traps that people who are busy can easily encounter and fall prey to. So here we go. Tip number 1, overpromise and underdeliver. When you're busy, and particularly when you want to build a business or make sure you keep your clients happy, you have maybe a tendency to overpromise and then underdeliver. It's so easy to want to please your customers, your colleagues, your clients, and want to put yourself in the best light. And it's so easy in the here and now to feel confident and comfortable that you can deliver. And then when things become more real, you suddenly find that you're up against all sorts of obstacles that make that promise a bit vulnerable. And as a result, you may underdeliver. And you're far, far, far better off not over-promising and still being able to deliver what you know is feasible and possible. So, tip number 1, don't overpromise and then under-deliver. Just a little story to go along with that. I was flying down to London one day from Manchester, and the pilot said on the flight, we're making really good progress, we should be on our station 10 minutes ahead of schedule. And the guy sitting next to me just shook his head and said to me, big mistake. He's now raised an expectation that we're going to be there 10 minutes early. And you know what? That may not happen. He needn't have said that. What difference is 10 minutes going to make? Sure enough, we landed 10 minutes early, but there was no station available to allow us to get off the plane, so we had to wait 20 minutes until one of the gates became clear. A really good example of overpromising and failing to deliver. So tip number 1, don't overpromise and then underdeliver. And tip number 2 kind of is associated with that. Learn how to say no. When you're busy and you're really up against it and you've got a full diary and a full workload, be careful not to say yes to everything. Learn how to say no. Because in the end, people won't trust your yes because they know it's possibly suspect in that you say yes there and then, but later on aren't able to deliver. So learn how to say no. Make a judgment call about what's feasible and realistic, and be comfortable with the discomfort of saying no. But my way of saying no, which you'll have heard about if you've listened to other podcasts, is to use the ASS technique, which is to acknowledge the request, that's the A, say no and give a reason, that's the first S, and the second S is suggest your next best alternative, which very often will do. And most people would respect an alternative that they can make up their minds up about, rather than you saying yes and then not being able to deliver. So tip number 2, learn how to say no when necessary. Tip number 3 is to always be aware of the opportunity cost of whatever it is you're working on. Often we're busy, and by being busy we feel we're being productive, and in many ways we are. But is it the best use of our time? Every time you choose to do something, you're clearly choosing not to do something else. And it's really important to be aware of what you're not doing as a consequence of what you are doing. It sounds a little bit higgledy-piggledy, but it's quite true. So if you're now listening to this podcast and it's going to take you, say, 15 or 20 minutes of your time to listen to this, then that's 15 or 20 minutes that you can't spend doing something else. And that's what's known as an opportunity cost. By spending 15 or 20 minutes listening to this, it's costing you the opportunity to do something else. So if you're busy, make sure you consider the opportunity cost of what you're being busy doing. Being busy isn't necessarily the most productive use of your time. So tip number 3, always be aware of the opportunity cost of whatever it is you're spending time doing. Tip number 4. Be aware of the difference between urgent and important. It's something I've perhaps banged on about in previous podcasts, but the tendency is in our British culture certainly to be driven by urgency. We prioritise what's the most urgent, and there's a logic to that. Of course, if something's urgent, it means that you're up against a very tight deadline. But if everything we do becomes urgent and we prioritise everything because it's urgent, then some things that are important, which may never become urgent, just won't get done. So preparing the strategy for the next 3 years may never become urgent. But what will become urgent is coping with the crisis that occurs because you had no clear strategy to deal with things. So build in important items to make sure that you're not entirely at the victim of urgency. So tip number 4 is consider the difference between urgent and important, and make sure that you give due attention to important as well as urgent. Tip number 5, be careful to not confuse business with busyness. Business spelt the normal way, and busyness, B-U-S-Y-N-E-S-S. Don't fool yourself into thinking because you're being busy, you're being effective. There's something to say here about the appeal and attractiveness of busyness. When you're busy, it helps the day fly, doesn't it? You where did the time go when you're busy? So it kind of helps you through the day to be busy. And of course, being busy gets you noticed. People think you're that busy that you must be being effective. And in fact, that's not true. If, for example, you're busy because you're bouncing from one crisis to another and managing those crises, it's worth stopping to think, should I be doing something to stop those crises happening in the first place? And of course, there's something psychologically powerful here in that if you're very good at preventing crises happening, then that part of your contribution doesn't get noticed. People think you're either lucky or underused or underemployed because you've managed to anticipate and forestall some of the crises that otherwise other people spend their time charging around putting into effect. So some people enjoy crisis management. Some people therefore have no real incentive to prevent crises happening because they like crisis management and they get noticed for it. So being busy is not the real deal, or being noticed being busy is not the real deal. Maybe you're more effective quietly getting things done in a preventative, proactive way rather than constantly being driven by a reactive need to be seen to be doing something. So tip number 5, beware of busyness as if it's the most productive you can be. Tip number 6, I'm calling this people over product, and this is really quite difficult. Most of us like people, and the danger is that by liking people, and it's nice to chat to people, it's nice to go for a coffee, it's nice to catch up on things, and all the time whilst we're doing that, and I'm not knocking that in a general way, but if we overindulge our people focus, it can be at the cost of product focus, which means getting on with the job. So how much of our time do we really want to devote to people connections, and how much do we need to devote to product connections? Now, clearly it's a balance, isn't it? We need to be good at working with and through people, but we need also to make sure we get the product out of the door. And all I'm asking you to do with tip number 6 is to maintain a balance and not overindulge, spending a lot of time with people and then excusing yourself by saying, well, it's important to keep the customer happy, it's important to keep good relations. Of course it is, but not at the expense of being productive. So tip number 6, find the balance between people and product. Tip number 7, and perhaps an obvious one that you would have anticipated on this topic, is perfectionism. it's quite difficult, this, because we don't know how valuable perfection is all the time. Sometimes, where it's highly risky and highly expensive, we need to get it as right as we can, to be as perfect, if you like, as we can. If you're travelling on a plane flying across the Atlantic, you want the whole process to be reliable and perfect as possible, which is why it costs a lot of money to get flying right. But there may be other times where good enough is good enough. So again, it's another balance issue. When do you need to be as perfect as you can, high standards, high quality, and when do you need to just make do, because making do is good enough? I use the example of shopping in an open market, an open air market. If you wanted a pound of apples, is it absolutely crucial that you find the best value market stall selling apples, or because there's only a marginal difference between 1 pound of apples on the market and another, is it worth just buying the first pound of apples that you come to? Beware, first of all, a tendency to perfection, and secondly, know when it's important to drive standards to the highest level possible, and know when it's just okay to be okay. I've already taken a decision with all my podcasts to only do them once. Now, I know that all of them have flaws. All of them have hesitations, or I stumble over words, or I lose some of what I'm trying to say. But you know what? It has to do. It's not perfect, and I know it's not perfect, but I'm hoping it's good enough for the time spent involved. That's tip number 7. Be balanced about how perfect you have to be. Tip number 8 is about notifications on emails. Switch them off. If you are someone who has notifications all the time, so every time you get an email, you're notified that you've had that email, it's a distraction. And more than a distraction, you may even be drawn to just looking at the email and responding to it, and so it pulls you away from whatever else you had planned to do. So either switch them off altogether, or switch them on for once or twice a day. You'll still get to see them, but they're less of an interrupt during your day. So tip number 8 is avoid notifications, or the overuse of notifications. Too many notifications are an absolute pain and a distraction, and will stop you staying focused on the main event. So tip number 8, avoid overuse of notifications. Tip number 9 is not planning for incidentals. This is the trap. So many people set up with a to-do list that looks on paper doable, but actually absolutely is not, because there's no account made of the incidentals that absolutely happen to most people most of the time, every day. Interruptions, for example. If you don't plan for an interruption, and yet you know your day consists of interruptions, then it's not a realistic plan. Now, I'm not suggesting that you can say, I will only be interrupted between 9 and 10, although that is possible. It's just making an allowance, and the simple tip here is to keep a log for 10 days, 10 working days, of how many interruptions you get, and the time spent involved both in the interruption and what it commits you to doing afterwards, and then make an allowance for that in your to-do list, because it's real. If you're going to spend time chatting with clients and keeping the customer warm, then it has to be on your to-do list. These incidentals eat away at time. Another good example of that is travelling time. If you do back-to-back meetings, where's the travelling between those meetings? We haven't reached Star Trek, beam me up Scotty just yet. So if you need to go from one meeting to another on a different site or building, then you have to make an allowance for the incidental of travel. So you become hoist, if you like, by your own inability to see the reality of the day and not planning for it. So tip number 9, avoid the trap of not planning, not allowing for incidentals. And tip number 10 is to avoid the when-then syndrome. Now, this was beautifully explained to me in Susan Jeffers' book, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. And it's a trap, because when I've spoken to A and B, then I'll make a decision. Or when I've read and researched the following reports, then I'll get on with it. But very often you don't get round to the when. And as a consequence, you don't get round to the then. So be careful that you don't get into a mindset and a set of dialogue that says, when then I will. Because the when may not happen. When I've saved enough money, then I'm going to. Well, you may never save enough money. So sometimes it's a false promise and gives you a false confidence in your ability to do things. But when sets a set of conditions. So when I've done X, Y, and Z, when I've read X, Y, and Z, when I've consulted X, Y, and Z, those are in effect conditions. And those conditions, if not met, are preventing you delivering. So be careful not to set too many when-then imperatives. So there we are. There are my top 10 tips of the traps for busy people. Let me quickly recap them. 1. The first trap, overpromise and underdeliver. The second trap, inability to say no. The third trap, not considering the opportunity cost of whatever it is you're working on. The fourth trap, seeing everything as urgent and as a result, missing the important. Trap 5 is thinking busyness is the same as business. Being busy is not the same as being productive. Tip or trap number 6 is focusing too much, too often on people relationships at the expense of getting the product out of the door. It's a balance. Tip number 7 is another balance. Don't be or seek perfectionism over everything. Sometimes good enough is good enough. Tip or trap number 8 is having notifications permanently on so that you're constantly distracted by the flow of emails. Tip or trap number 9, not planning for the incidental disruptions and interruptions, travelling time and so on that are likely in any working day. And trap number 10 is saying when this then that too often. When then becomes a constraint that stops you delivering on your deliverables. So that's it. Those are my top 10 traps for busy people. Hope you found them useful. Thanks for listening. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, make sure you subscribe. You will still get the podcast for free, but you will also get an alert to let you know when the next podcast is available. And please recommend the podcast to anyone else you think might like it and benefit from it. Also, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a review and any other comment, because they'll help promote the podcast series on the relevant platform. So, bye for now.